14 days. That is how long Arthur Percival had been out of a Japanese prison camp when he was told to stand 3 feet behind Douglas MacArthur on the deck of the USS Missouri. 14 days earlier, he had been behind wire in Manchuria, 60 pounds underweight, not certain the guards would let him live long enough to see the war end. He had not asked to be there. Nobody asked him. He was placed on that deck the way you play a table or a photograph because of what his face would say to the 11 Japanese officers about to walk up that gangway. And standing beside him was an American who had spent 3 years in the same camps believing his own country had written him off as a coward. This is the story of why those 2 men were put on that deck, and it does not begin in Tokyo Bay. Tokyo Bay, the 2nd of September, 1945. 6 minutes before 9 in the morning, the water was flat and gray, and 258 Allied warships lay at anchor across it. On the veranda deck of the battleship Missouri, 300 men stood in silence, waiting for a launch to cross the last stretch of open water. That is the part of this story that most accounts leave out, because the surrender aboard the Missouri is usually told as a single moment. A document, a set of signatures, an American general reading a prepared statement. 23 minutes and the war was over. But the 23 minutes were not the story. The 23 minutes were the result. The story is what it took to put Arthur Percival on that deck. 3.5 years earlier, on the 15th of February, 1942, Percival had walked out of the British lines outside Singapore carrying 2 flags. One was a white flag of truce, the other was a Union Jack. He was 54 years old. He was the general officer commanding Malaya, which meant that everything British in that theater was his responsibility. He was tall, thin, quiet, with slightly protruding front teeth and a manner that his critics called donnish and his defenders called measured. He had come up through the First World War as a volunteer who enlisted as a private in 914 and finished as a decorated battalion commander. He was not a fool and he was not a coward, though he would spend the rest of his life being described as both. He had spent the previous 10 weeks losing. The Japanese 25th Army under Lieutenant General Yamashita Tomoyuki had come down the Malay Peninsula faster than anyone in London had believed possible. They had used bicycles. They had gone around British roadblocks through jungle that British planners had classified as impassable. They had taken airfields that the Royal Air Force had built and then could not defend. By the end of January, the whole of the peninsula was gone, and what remained of Percival's command had pulled back across the causeway onto Singapore Island, and behind them, the causeway was blown, and it was not enough. The island fell in 7 days. On the afternoon of the 15th of February, Percival walked to meet Yamashita at the Ford Motor Factory at Bukit Timah, a low modern building with an Art Deco frontage that the Japanese had taken and made their forward headquarters. He arrived in the early evening. He sat down across a table from Yamashita in a room the Japanese controlled under light the Japanese had positioned. In front of cameras the Japanese had brought. He surrendered approximately 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops. The Japanese force that took the island was smaller, substantially smaller. And here is the detail that would poison the next 3 decades of Percival's life. Yamashita's men were nearly out of ammunition. His supply lines were stretched to breaking. He had gambled everything on speed and on the assumption that the British would fold before they discovered how thin the Japanese position actually was. Yamashita said after the war that his position had been far weaker than Percival knew, and that a counterattack could have changed the outcome. How much of that was hindsight is still argued over. Percival did not know. He had reports of a water supply about to fail, of a millions packed into a burning city, of formations that had disintegrated, of ammunition figures he did not trust. He made a decision with the information he had. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British military history. And that phrase, once spoken by that man, attached itself to Arthur Percival like a second name and never came off. But Yamashita understood something that Churchill did not, or did not need to. Yamashita understood that a defeat is an event and a humiliation is a photograph. He had Percival photographed at that table. Pale, gaunt, sitting slightly hunched, flanked by his own officers, one of whom carried the Union Jack. The image was distributed across occupied Asia for months. It ran in Japanese news printed on leaflets. It was posted in cities from Rangoon to Manila with captions in 6 languages, and the message underneath was always the same. Look at this man. Look at what the British Empire looks like when you push it. 3 centuries of empire, and it folds in an afternoon. That photograph did work. Political work. It told hundreds of millions of colonized people across Asia that the white empires were not permanent and not invincible. And that particular idea, once released, was never going back into the box. Percival, in the picture, is looking down. He would spend the next 3 years and 6 months as a prisoner of the men who took that photograph. He was first held at Changi, on the island he had just surrendered, inside a British-built prison now run by the Japanese. In August 1942, The Japanese moved their most senior Allied captives out of Southeast Asia entirely. Percival was shipped to Formosa, the island now called Taiwan, to a camp on the eastern coast, where generals and colonels who had commanded armies were made to work small agricultural plots and were slapped by guards a third their age. The Japanese kept a specific category of prisoners separate from the rest: senior officers, colonial governors, men whose names carried weight. They were not worked to death on the railways. They were preserved, moved, and kept because they were assets, and because at some future negotiating table they might be worth something. In 1944, as the war turned, they were moved again, north out of the reach of the advancing Americans, to Manchuria, in the far northeast of the Japanese Empire. Percival ended the war at a camp near a place called Hushian, in what is now away from any ocean, and a long way from anyone who was looking for him. He was there in the summer of 1945 when the war entered its last weeks, and this is where the second thing happens that most tellings skip entirely. Percival almost did not survive to stand on the Missouri. Not because of illness, though he had lost 60 pounds and looked it. Not because of the camps, though men died in them constantly. But because of a policy question that hung over every senior Allied prisoner in Japanese hands in the summer of 1945, and which none of them could resolve, and all of them thought about. The Japanese military had issued instructions concerning prisoners of war in the event that Allied forces reached the camps. Surviving from Taiwan, dated to 1944, laid out the disposition of prisoners under emergency conditions in terms that were not ambiguous about what disposition could mean. Whether such instructions were ever formally applied to Percival or to the senior officers held with him in Manchuria has never been established with certainty. The paper trail is incomplete, and the historical debate about how widely those orders circulated is still open. But that is a distinction available to historians afterward. It was not available to the men inside the wire. What they knew was that the Japanese were losing, and that the guards knew it, and that nobody had told them what happened to prisoners in a defeat. They knew that camps had been emptied before. They knew that in the Philippines, at Palawan, in December 1944, American prisoners had been driven into air raid shelters and burned alive as American forces approached, and that a small number had escaped to tell it. They knew that the closer liberation came, the more dangerous their position became, because a liberated general is a witness, and a dead one is not. So Percival spent the spring and summer of 1945 waiting inside a very specific kind of uncertainty, not the uncertainty of whether the war would be won. By then that was clear even inside a camp in Manchuria from the guards' faces and the rumors and the direction of things. The uncertainty was narrower and more personal than that. It was whether the end of the war and the end of his own life would arrive in that order or in the other one. He did not, so far as any record shows, discuss this with anyone. He was not a man who discussed things. On the 9th of August, 1945, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. 1.5 million Soviet troops came across the border in a matter of days, and the Japanese Kwantung Army, which had been the pride of the Imperial Army in the 1930s and had since been stripped of its best formations, came apart under them. On the 15th of August, the Emperor's recorded broadcast went out across Japan and its remaining territories, and in Washington and in Chungking, a small number of people were now looking at a map with a very urgent problem on it. There were tens of thousands of Allied prisoners scattered across Manchuria, China, and Korea, in camps that Allied forces could not reach for weeks. Their guards had just been told they had lost. Nobody knew what those guards would do next, and nobody could get there in time by any conventional means. So they did not use conventional means. Beginning on the 16th of August, the American Office of Strategic Services launched a series of Japanese-held territory across China and Manchuria, each with same brief land: find the camp, take control of the situation, keep the prisoners alive until the war caught up. They were called mercy missions. Each was a handful of men dropping into a country that had not yet been told the war was over, among an army that had not yet decided how it was going to take that news. The team that went into Manchuria was codenamed Cardinal. It dropped near Mukden on the 16th of August, into the area of the main prison camp there, and its members were on the ground and in Japanese custody within hours, because the local garrison had received no orders and did not believe them. It was through that operation, in the days that followed, that the American teams established where the senior officers were being held. At the smaller camp at Haixian, some distance to the northeast. And that is where they found them, a group of the highest-ranking Allied prisoners in Japanese hands, men who had commanded armies and territories, thin and alive. Among them was Arthur Percival, and among them was another man, an American, who matters enormously to what happened on the Missouri deck 2 weeks later. Lieutenant General Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright IV. cavalryman, tall, extremely thin even before captivity, with a long lined face and a limp. In May 1942, he had surrendered Corregidor, and with it the remaining American and Filipino forces in the Philippines, to the Japanese 14th Army. He had chances to be taken off the rock before the end. He did not take them. He stayed, and he surrendered, and he was taken. And he was moved north through the same system that had taken Percival, until the two of them ended in the same camp in Manchuria. Wainwright had been a prisoner for 3 years and 3 months, and Wainwright believed something about himself that was completely wrong. He believed he was going home in disgrace. He believed that the surrender of Corregidor had ended his career and stained his name, that he would be court-martialed or quietly retired, that no American commander who had handed an army to the Japanese could expect anything else. He had spent 3 years turning that over in a cell. When the camp was liberated and he was told he was being flown out, he asked, in one of the few remarks that survives from those days, whether the American people would understand what he had done. He did not know that in 1942, when General George Marshall proposed the Medal of Honor for him, it was MacArthur who objected, and that 3 years later had changed his mind. He did not know that his name had become in the United States a symbol of endurance rather than failure. He did not know that a nation had spent 3 years thinking of him as the man who stayed. He found out later. He would receive that Medal of Honor from Truman on the 10th of September, 8 days after the Missouri. But on the 25th of August, when he and Percival were flown out of Manchuria, he did not know any of it. He thought he was going to answer for something, so consider the two men who now boarded an aircraft together and flew south out of Manchuria in the last week of August 1945. An American who had surrendered the Philippines and expected to be disgraced for it. A Briton who had surrendered Singapore and had already been disgraced for it, publicly, by his own prime minister, in a phrase that would follow him into his obituary. Neither of them knew where they were being taken. Neither of them had been told what was wanted from them. They went first to Chungking, then onward, and on the 31st of August, in Yokohama, they were brought to a hotel where General Douglas MacArthur was waiting. MacArthur was 65. He was the supreme commander for the Allied powers, and in 11 days he would be the effective ruler of Japan. He had known Wainwright for decades. They had served together in the Philippines. He had left on orders in March 1942, and Wainwright had stayed. And the surrender had happened on Wainwright's watch and not on MacArthur's. And both men had lived with the shape of that ever since. When Wainwright walked into that room, thin, stooped, on a cane, MacArthur stood up and crossed the floor and embraced him. Accounts differ on exactly what was said. What is consistent across them is that Wainwright arrived braced for judgment and did not receive it. And then MacArthur told both of them what he wanted. He wanted them on the Missouri, not as spectators, not in the crowd on the superstructure with the correspondents and the ship's crew. He wanted them standing directly behind him, in the front rank, at the table, in the place where the Japanese delegation would have to look at them. Percival had not asked for this. Wainwright had not asked for this. It had been decided for them. And to understand why, you have to understand what MacArthur thought a surrender ceremony actually was. Most people assume it is an administrative event. Documents change hands, lawyers and archivists file the paper. MacArthur did not think that at all. MacArthur thought a surrender ceremony was a piece of construction, something you build, deliberately. A deck, a table, a flag, a sequence. A set of witnesses for the purpose of fixing one specific version of reality in place so hard that it cannot be pried loose later. Because he had watched what happened when nobody bothered. In November 1918, the German army surrendered in a railway carriage in a forest in Compiègne. No German city saw an occupying army. No German civilian watched their generals hand over anything to anyone. The armistice was signed by a civilian delegation, and the German field army marched home in formation, and in some towns it was met with flowers. And into that vacuum over the following years, the German officer corps poured a story. The army was never defeated in the field. The army was betrayed from behind, by politicians, by Jews, by the home front. The stab-in-the-back myth. The German army, in the autumn of 1918, was in a state of collapse, and its own high command had told the government so. But truth was not the point. The point was that there was no physical evidence to the contrary that an ordinary German could see with their own eyes. So the myth had room to grow, and it grew. An entire generation was raised inside it. And 21 years later, the world paid for that in a currency it is still counting. MacArthur had been in France in 1918. He had commanded a brigade there and been wounded and gassed and decorated, and he had come home into the peace that was supposed to be permanent, and he had watched it fail. In 9945, he was not going to hand the Japanese officer corps the same building material, which is why every element of the Missouri ceremony was engineered. The location, not on land, not in a captured city, but on an American battleship at anchor inside Tokyo Bay, in Japanese home water, in sight of the Japanese coast. The Japanese delegation would have to cross their own water to reach it. The ship, the Missouri, named for the home state of the sitting president. The table, not the ship's ceremonial furniture, a mess table brought up from the crew's quarters, because the ceremonial table proved too small, covered with a green baize cloth borrowed from the ship's wardroom. There is something in that detail. The instrument that ended the largest war in human history was signed on a table where sailors ate. Flags, two of them chosen and placed. One was an American flag that, by long tradition, is said to have flown over the Capitol in Washington on the 7th of December, 1941. The other, mounted in a frame on the bulkhead overlooking the table, was a 31-star American flag from the 1850s, brought to Japan by Commodore Matthew Perry's squadron in 1853, the flag that had flown when the United States forced the opening of a closed Japan 92 years earlier. Displayed reversed, because the fabric was fragile and only that side could be shown. And there is something almost too neat about that. An old flag flown backwards over the closing of a circle it had started. The order of signatures on the document, the Japanese first, the Allied powers after, that was not courtesy. A document where the defeated sign first and the victors sign after is a document that records, permanently, in its own structure, who came to answer to whom. The timing of the aircraft. Over 1,000 carrier planes and B-29s were to pass over the bay at low level, and the flyover was scheduled to arrive at the moment the last signature went down, so that the sound of it would reach the deck seconds afterward and the Japanese delegation would hear what the Allied air forces looked like from underneath. Every one of those decisions was a sentence in an argument, and the witnesses were the loudest sentence in it. Because when the Japanese delegation crossed that deck and approached that table, the two men standing directly behind MacArthur, the two faces in their direct line of sight. Unavoidable. At close range would be the man who surrendered Singapore and the man who surrendered Corregidor. The two most photographed Allied capitulations of the entire Pacific War. The two images the Japanese propaganda ministry had used most heavily for years to demonstrate that the Western empires were hollow. Standing on the deck in uniform, behind the winner. The Japanese officers coming aboard would know exactly who they were. They would have seen the photographs. They had helped distribute them. MacArthur had built their presence into the architecture of the thing. And it required no translation. And it admitted no argument. And it did not need a single word spoken. That was the point of Arthur Percival on that deck. He was not decoration, he was evidence. Now go back to the morning. At 8:56 on the 2nd of September, the Japanese delegation came up the starboard gangway. There were 11 of them. Diplomats, army officers, naval officers, and the two men who would sign. They wore formal dress, some in morning coats and top hats. The diplomats, and the officers in uniform with high collars. They had come out from shore aboard a destroyer and transferred to the Missouri. At the head of the delegation, coming up the gangway with difficulty, was Shigemitsu Mamoru. 58 years of Japan. A career diplomat, not a soldier, and a man with a complicated record. He had served the wartime government, but had also been among those who pushed toward ending the war. In April 1932, in Hongqiu Park in Shanghai, a bomb thrown by a Korean independence activist had killed and maimed a number of Japanese officials. Shigemitsu survived it and lost his left leg. He climbed the gangway of the Missouri on a wooden prosthetic and a cane, one step at a time. In a top hat and morning coat, in front of 300 silent Allied officers and a wall of cameras. And it took him a long time, and he climbed it himself. Behind him came General Umezu Yoshijiro, 63 years old, Chief of the Army General Staff, the most senior serving officer in the Imperial Japanese Army, signing on behalf of Imperial General Headquarters. And Umezu was there under protest. In the Imperial Conference deliberations of August 1945, when the Japanese leadership argued over whether to accept the Potsdam terms, Umezu had been on the side that said no. He had argued for conditions that Japan should accept only on terms that preserved the military's position, terms the Allies were never going to grant. When the Emperor intervened and the decision went the other way, Umezu complied. He was a soldier, and the Emperor had spoken and he complied. He had reportedly resisted being named as the military signatory at all and had to be prevailed upon before he agreed to come. So the man now walking across the Missouri's deck to sign away the Imperial Japanese Army had 3 weeks earlier held out for terms the Allies had already refused to give. He came aboard with his back absolutely straight. The delegation was brought to a position in front of the table and halted, and there they stood, and waited, and the American and Allied officers on the deck watched them, and nobody moved. And what the men on that deck observed in the accounts they left afterward was a delegation holding itself with extraordinary rigidity. Faces arranged into total blankness. Eyes fixed above the heads of the men in front of them, no visible reaction of any. Some of the officers watching read that as shock. Some read it as shame, and some read it as something else entirely, as a last available act. As men who had been stripped of every other form of resistance and had decided that the one thing still in their possession was the manner in which they stood, and that they would hold it, and that no one on that deck would be given the satisfaction of seeing a Japanese officer bend. It is impossible at this distance to know with certainty which reading is correct. Nobody photographed the inside of Umezu Yoshijiro's head. What survives are impressions recorded by observers who were themselves at the peak of an emotion and not neutral about what they were looking at. But the impression was widely shared. And it is the origin of the story that has been retold ever since, that the Japanese officers on the Missouri refused to bow. Whether or not that is precisely what was happening, here is what is certain. It did not matter. And it did not matter because of exactly the thing MacArthur had spent weeks building. You could stand as straight as you liked. You could keep your face empty. You could look at a point on the horizon and refuse to acknowledge a single human being on that deck. And none of it would move the ship, or lower the flag, the signatures, or alter by one word the document lying on that green baize cloth. MacArthur had designed a ceremony in which the only variable left to the Japanese delegation was their posture while it happened to them. Everything else had already been decided. And 3 feet behind MacArthur's left shoulder, in the front rank, in the position he had been assigned and had not requested, stood a 57-year-old man who had spent 42 months in Japanese camps and who was now looking at the same thing from the other side of it. In February 1942, Arthur Percival had sat at a table in a room controlled by his enemy, in front of cameras his enemy had positioned, and signed under conditions his enemy had set. Everything in that room had moved in one direction, now it moved in the other. Same man, different table. MacArthur stepped forward to the microphones. Behind him, the Missouri's guns were trained fore and aft. The crew was packed onto every gun turret and railing and superstructure that would hold a man, and beyond the rail the bay was full of ships to the horizon. It was 9:02 in the morning. It would take 23 minutes. MacArthur stepped up to the microphones and began to speak, and the first thing anyone on that deck noticed was that his hands were shaking. Not badly, not so that a camera would catch it. But the paper he held was moving, and men standing close enough to see it later remarked on it, because in 5 years of war, very few people had ever seen Douglas MacArthur's hands do anything he had not instructed them to do. He was 65 years old. He had worn a uniform since he entered West Point in 1899. He had commanded a brigade in France in 1918 and been gassed and wounded and decorated for it. He had run the military academy at West Point. He had been Army Chief of Staff. He had left the Philippines under direct presidential order in March of 1942 and spent the 2.5 years afterward fighting his way back to it. And now he stood on a battleship in the enemy's own harbor with a sheet of paper in his hands, and the paper was trembling. He read for a little under 3 minutes. He said that the issues had been decided on the battlefields of the world, and that the matter before them was not one for debate. He said he hoped that from this solemn occasion a better world would emerge out of the blood and the carnage of the past. He said he intended to discharge his responsibilities with justice and tolerance, and to see the terms of surrender fully and faithfully complied with. Justice and tolerance. Those 2 words, spoken by that man, in that harbor, 28 days after Nagasaki. It is worth sitting with what those words were doing there, because they were not sentiment. They were policy, announced in advance, in front of the world's press, in a form that could not afterward be quietly walked back. MacArthur was about to become the effective ruler of a nation of 70 million people, most of whom had spent 4 years being told that Americans would butcher them if they ever set foot on Japanese soil. He had a very short window in which to establish what kind of occupation this was going to be, and he chose to establish it in the first 3 minutes, before a single signature had been written. He was not describing what had just happened, he was describing what he intended to build out of it. Then he stopped and set the paper down and gestured toward the table. Shigemitsu Mamoru came forward first. He was the foreign minister, signing on behalf of the emperor and the Japanese government, and he was signing first because the sequence had been written that way. He came across the deck slowly, on the wooden leg he had worn since Shanghai in 1932, planting the cane and then bringing the leg through and then the good leg after it, and every man on that deck had to stand and watch him do it. He handed his hat and gloves and cane to an aide. He sat down, and then nothing happened. Shigemitsu sat in front of the 2 open documents, one bound in leather for the Allies, one in canvas for the Japanese, and he looked at them. He turned a page, he looked at that, he shifted the paper slightly. He appeared to be reading or searching or waiting. The deck was completely silent. 300 men, dozens of cameras, and a Japanese diplomat sitting still with a pen in his hand. There has been argument ever since about what was actually happening in those seconds. Some who were there believed he was genuinely confused about where to sign. The documents were unfamiliar, and the signature lines were not marked in the way a Japanese official document would have marked them. Others believed he was buying time, or steadying himself, or performing a last small hesitation because it was the only thing left that was his to perform. What is not in dispute is how long it went on. It went on long enough to become unbearable. MacArthur stood a few feet away and watched it and said nothing. Then, without moving from where he stood, he spoke to his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Richard Caron Sutherland, 51 years old. Career officer, the man who had run MacArthur's headquarters through the Philippines and Australia and New Guinea, and who had a reputation among the staff for being the most disliked officer in the theater, because that was his function. MacArthur was the voice. Sutherland was the instrument. When something needed to be done coldly, Sutherland did it. Sutherland walked to the table and showed Shigemitsu where to sign. That was the whole of it. A few steps, a hand indicating a line on a page. But watch what it accomplished, because this is the entire ceremony in miniature. A moment of ambiguity had opened up a pause that could have been read later, as a Japanese hesitated. A flicker of reluctance preserved on film. And MacArthur closed it in under 10 seconds without raising his voice, without touching anything, without allowing the smallest crack to appear in the record. Shigemitsu signed Fowler. He wrote his name in Japanese characters, then stood, retrieved his cane, and moved back to his place among the delegation. And then General Umezu Yoshijiro came forward. He did not sit down. The chair was there. Shigemitsu had used it. Umezu walked to the table, leaned forward from the waist, took the pen, and wrote his signature standing up. Then he straightened, put the pen down, turned, and walked back to his place without looking at MacArthur, without looking at the Allied officers, without acknowledging that anyone else was present on that deck at all. Chief of the Army General Staff, the senior serving officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, the man who 3 weeks earlier had argued in front of the Emperor for conditions the Allies had already refused. He had lost that argument, and he had obeyed. And here he was, but he had decided somewhere in advance exactly how he was going to hold his body while he did it. And he held it that way from the first step to the last, and he did not deviate once. The chair was a small thing, but a man who sits down, accepts on a table, and signs standing has told you, without saying a word, that he is not staying. And it changed nothing whatsoever, because here is what was actually true on that deck at 9:05 in the morning. The harbor was full of Allied warships. The flag over the table carried the date of the 7th of December, 1941. The names on the document ran Japanese first, Allied second, in an order that recorded permanently who had come to answer to whom. There were 300 Allied officers standing on that ship, and one of them, standing 3 feet behind MacArthur's left shoulder, was a British lieutenant general who had walked out of a Manchurian prison camp 2 weeks earlier. You could refuse the chair, you could refuse the bow, you could keep your face empty and your eyes above the horizon and give the cameras nothing. None of it moved one rivet of that ship. That was the design. MacArthur signed next, on behalf of all the Allied powers, using 5 pens. That was deliberate, too. He signed a few letters, handed the pen away, took another, signed a few more. First pen went to Wainwright. Second went to Percival. Read that again, because it is the part people miss. Douglas MacArthur, standing at the table that ended the Second World War, wrote his name in installments so that the first 2 men to receive a piece of it would be the 2 Allied generals who had surrendered to Japan. Then Chester Nimitz signed for the United States. Then the representatives of China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. 9 minutes of signatures, and while those signatures were being written, Arthur Percival stood 3 feet away and did not move. There is no record of what he thought. There is almost never a record of what Percival thought. He was not a man who narrated himself, and after the war, he did not write the book that would have made him money and given him a defense, and he did not give the settle scores with the men who had blamed him. But we can say with confidence what he was looking at because it was in front of him. He was looking at the exact structural inversion of the 15th of February, 1942. At the Ford factory at Bukit Timah, he had sat at a table in a room his enemy controlled. The lights were theirs. The cameras were theirs. The terms were theirs. The photographs that came out of that room were selected by them and distributed by them, and the version of events that reached the world was the version they wrote. Every single one of those variables had now reversed. The ship was American, the table was American, the cameras belonged to the Allied press. The document had been drafted in Washington. And the man who had once been photographed for the purpose of humiliating an empire was now standing, in uniform, in the front rank, exactly where the Japanese delegation had to see him. He had not defeated anyone. He had lost his battle, and he would always have lost his battle. Nothing on that deck erased Singapore. But there is a difference between erasing something and answering it. Percival was not being redeemed. He was being used as evidence, and he seems to have understood that perfectly well and to have accepted the role without complaint, because the evidence needed to be given, and he was the one who could give it. Some men would have found that humiliating, being displayed, being positioned, being the visual aid. Percival stood there for 23 minutes and gave no sign of anything at all. At 9:25 in the morning, the last Allied signature went onto the document, and then the sound started. They came in from the south, low over the water, wave after wave carrier planes first, then the B-29s in formation above them. More than 1,900 aircraft passing over Tokyo Bay in a stream that took several minutes to cross overhead. Men on the deck said the sound arrived a beat behind the sight of them, the way it does. And then it filled everything. And for the length of that flyover, no one on that ship could hear anything else at all. The Japanese delegation stood underneath it and looked at the horizon. Then it thinned, and the last of them went north over the shoreline, and the noise fell away, and the bay went quiet again. 23 minutes, start to finish. The delegation was escorted back down the gangway to the launch. They crossed the water to the destroyer that had brought them. There was no closing formality of any kind because MacArthur had not written one. They came aboard as the representatives of an empire, and they left as the administrators of a defeated country under occupation, and the distance between those two facts was 23 minutes long. And Arthur Percival, who had been standing at attention that entire time, who was 57 years old and 60 pounds underweight and 14 days out of a Manchurian prison camp, was told that evening that he was getting on another aircraft. He was going to the Philippines, because the last thing MacArthur had arranged was not on that ship at all. The aircraft that carried Arthur Percival out of Tokyo Bay flew south through the night of the 2nd of September, 1945. He had been standing on a battleship deck that morning. He had been in a prison camp in Manchuria 2 weeks before that. He was 57 years old, 60 pounds underweight, and he had not slept properly in 3.5 years. And now he was in the air again over the Pacific with no clear idea of what was being asked of him. He was going to Baguio, a mountain town in northern Luzon, 5,000 feet up in the pines, where the American colonial administration had built a summer capital because the heat in Manila was unbearable, and the men who ran the Philippines wanted somewhere cool to sleep. The Japanese had taken it in December of 1941. They had used the American High Commissioner's residence at Camp John Hay as a headquarters. American and Filipino forces had taken it back in April of 1945 after fighting that left the building shot through, and the town mostly rubble. And in that building, on the 3rd of September, 1945, a ceremony was scheduled. Percival was not told the details in advance. He was told to be on the aircraft. Now go back one day, to the same morning as the Missouri, and move 800 miles southwest, to the mountains of Ifugao Province. While Douglas MacArthur was reading from a trembling sheet of paper in Tokyo Bay, a 59-year-old Japanese general was walking down out of the Cordillera Mountains on foot. General Yamashita Tomoyuki, the Tiger of Malaya, the man who had taken Singapore in 70 days with a force half the size of the one he beat. The man who had sat across a table from Arthur Percival at the Ford factory at Bukit Timah and arranged for the photograph. He had been in those mountains since the spring. After Singapore, Yamashita had been shipped off to Manchuria sidelined, kept away from Tokyo, because his victory had made him too popular and Tojo did not want a rival. He spent 2 years commanding a training army in a place where nothing happened. Then in the autumn of 1944, with the Philippines about to be invaded and the situation beyond saving, they finally sent for him. He arrived in Manila days before the American landings at Leyte and inherited a defense that could not be conducted, an army he did not know, and a naval command that would not take his orders. He made a decision that has been argued about ever since. He declared Manila an open city and pulled his ground forces out into the mountains, intending to fight a long, delaying action in terrain that favored him. Japanese naval troops in Manila did not withdraw. They stayed, and in February of 1945, they destroyed the city and killed something on the order of 100,000 Filipino civilians in a month of atrocity that has few equals anywhere in that war. Yamashita was in the mountains, 200 kilometers away, with communications that had largely collapsed. That fact, where he was, what he knew, what he could have stopped, would decide how he died. By August of 1945, he had roughly 50,000 men left of the Shobu group, starving in high country, cut off, still holding out. On the 15th, the surrender broadcast came. It took time to reach him and more time to be believed. On the 2nd of September, Filipino guerrilla units of the United States Army Forces in the Philippines, northern Luzon, near Kiangan, and Yamashita came down out of the mountains and gave himself up. He was flown to Baguio, and that is where MacArthur's last arrangement was waiting. The ceremony at the American residence at Camp John Hay was scheduled for the morning of the 3rd of September. The document was an instrument of surrender covering all Japanese forces in the Philippine Islands. The signing officer for the United States was Major General Edmund Herman Levy, Deputy Commander of United States Army Forces in the Western Pacific. Yamashita would sign for the Army. Vice Admiral Okochi Denshichi, Commander of the Naval Forces in the Philippines, would sign for the Navy. The ceremony did not begin on time. It was held for 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours in a bullet-scared house in the Pines, with the participants seated and waiting, and the Japanese delegation sitting in that room the entire time because 2 aircraft were still inbound, and the men aboard them had to be in that room before anything was signed. One carried Jonathan Wainwright. The other carried Arthur Percival. Sit with that for a moment. The formal surrender of every Japanese soldier in the Philippines, 50,000 men in the field. The last great command of the Imperial Japanese Army outside the home islands was held, deliberately, in front of the Japanese officers who had to sit there and wait, so that the general who lost Corregidor and the general who lost Singapore could be in the room when the pen moved. Wainwright had been the man who surrendered the Philippines. He was brought back to the Philippines to watch the Philippines handed back. And Percival was brought so that Yamashita would have to look at him. The aircraft arrived. The 2 men were brought in. 6'2" and hollowed out, walking with a cane. Percival beside him, in a plain uniform. They took their places at the long table, and Yamashita, according to those who were watching for it, gave no sign of recognition at all. There is no reliable account of any exchange between the 2 men. There is no dialogue on the record. What accounts survive describe a Japanese general who sat with a stiff and blank composure and looked at the papers in front of him and did not look for Percival's face across the room, which may have been control. Or may have been that 3.5 years of starvation had changed Arthur Percival enough that the man from the Ford factory was genuinely not immediately there in front of him. Either way, the room did not need the recognition. The room only needed the fact. At around 10 minutes past noon on the 3rd of September, 1945, Yamashita Tomoyuki signed the surrender of all Japanese forces in the Philippines. And by the accounts of that day, the swords were surrendered as well. That detail matters more than it looks. In the Southeast Asia theater, the British commander, Lord Mountbatten, insisting on exactly this ritual over the objections of tradition, because he had understood that a signature is an abstraction and a sword is an object. A signature can be explained away. A sword in the other man's hands cannot. Yamashita gave up his sword in the room where Arthur Percival was sitting. 6 months and 19 days after the photograph at Bukit Timah. Percival did not speak. He did not, by any account, react. He sat in the room and watched it happen, and then he got up and left when it was over. And there is no diary entry, no letter, no recorded remark that tells us what any of it felt like. That silence is not an absence in this story. It is the story. It is the most consistent single thing about the man across 40 years of public life. He did not explain himself. He did not settle scores. He did not then or ever take the opening that was offered to him. And he was offered it repeatedly. Yamashita's trial opened in Manila on the 29th of October, 1945. Before a United States military commission of 5 American generals, in the ballroom of the ruined High Commissioner's residence. He was not charged with anything he personally ordered. That is the crucial point, and it is why the case is still taught in law schools 80 years later. He was charged with failing to control the troops under his command, specifically with permitting them to commit atrocities, above all the destruction of Manila and the murder of its civilians. The prosecution did not attempt to prove he ordered it. It argued that he was responsible because he was in command and it happened. The defense, which was conducted with real determination by American Army lawyers assigned to him who came to believe in the case they were making, argued that his communications had disintegrated, that the naval troops who destroyed Manila were not effectively under his control, that he had ordered the city evacuated, and that no commander on earth could be held criminally liable for crimes he did not know about and could not have prevented. The commission convicted him on the 7th of December, 1945, 4 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, which was noticed at the time, and sentenced him to death by hanging. His American lawyers took it to the Supreme Court of the United States. In re Yamashita was decided on the 4th of February, 1946. The court declined to intervene 6-2, but 2 justices dissented, and they dissented in language that has outlived the case. Justice Frank Murphy wrote that the charge made no allegation that Yamashita had ordered, condoned, or even known of the crime, and warned that a standard which convicts a commander for the acts of his men, without proof of knowledge or complicity, was a standard that could be turned on any commander of any army, including an American one. Justice Wiley Rutledge wrote separately and just as hard. Yamashita was hanged on the 23rd of February, 1946. 946 at Los Baños, in Laguna Province, south of Manila. He was 60 years old. The doctrine that killed him is now known as the Yamashita Standard, or Command Responsibility, and it is written into the statutes of every international war crimes tribunal that has operated since Nuremberg's successors: the Yugoslavia Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, the International Criminal Court. The principle that a commander is answerable for what his men do under his authority entered modern law through the trial of the man who took Singapore. Whether it was justly applied to him in 945 is a question that serious historians and serious lawyers still disagree about loudly. And here is what Arthur Percival did about all of it: nothing. There is no record of Percival testifying at the Manila trial. He was not called as a prosecution witness against the man who had beaten him. He was in the room at Baguio because MacArthur put him there, and after that he went home, and the trial ran its course without him. He also never wrote the book, not the angry one. He published one account of the Malayan campaign in 1949, a restrained military narrative called The War in Malaya, and it is notable mostly for what it declines to do. It does not blame Whitehall for the aircraft that never arrived. It does not blame the Admiralty for the loss of the Prince of Wales and the repulse in the first 3 days. It does not blame Australia or India or the men under his command. It does not blame Churchill. Every one of those arguments was available to him. Several of them were and are substantially true. The defense of Malaya had been under-resourced for years by a government that had decided reasonably enough that Europe came first. The air strength on the peninsula was a fraction of what the planners themselves said was required. The 2 capital ships sent east as a deterrent were sunk on the 10th of December, 1941, because they had no air cover, which meant that from the first week of the campaign there was no fleet and no air force, and the whole strategic assumption on which the defense of Singapore rested had already evaporated. Reinforcements that arrived in the last weeks were partly untrained. Churchill had been told repeatedly what was missing and had made other choices. Percival could have said all of it. He knew it better than anyone alive. Instead, he wrote a book that reads like a staff appreciation, and he let Churchill's phrase stand. The worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British military history. That phrase went into the newspapers in 1942, and it went into the reference works in the 1950s, and it went into his obituary in 1966. And it is today. First sentence most people ever read about him. He was never given another command. He came home in September of 1945, and there was no position for him. He was retired in 1946. He was not knighted, which for a lieutenant general of his seniority in service was a silence loud enough to hear across the whole of the British Army. He had a Distinguished Service Order and a bar to it, a Military Cross, and an OB, and he had earned every one of them in France between 1914 and 1918 as a man who enlisted in the ranks as a private in the first month of the war, and came out a battalion commander who had been wounded and decorated repeatedly for going forward. None of it counted for anything after Singapore. It never does. And this is where the last part of Arthur Percival's life begins, the part almost nobody knows. And for anyone who has ever had to decide what to do with the rest of a life after the worst thing in it, it is the only part that matters. He went to work for the men who had been in the camps with him. There were tens of thousands of British and Commonwealth former prisoners of the Japanese coming home in late 1945 and 1946, the Far East prisoners of war. And they came home to a country that did not really know what to do with them, had its liberation newsreels and its parades. The men coming back from Burma Railway and the mines of Kyushu came back thin and yellow with old jaundice, carrying tropical diseases British doctors had never seen, carrying dysentery damage and beriberi damage and nightmares nobody had a vocabulary for in 1946. They came home to a nation that was exhausted, rationed, bombed out, and finished with the whole subject. A great many of them found that people did not want to hear about it. Some found that their own families would change the subject. There was a widespread and quietly poisonous assumption in some quarters that being taken prisoner was itself a kind of failure. And these men had been taken prisoner by the tens of thousands, all at once. Of 1,942 Singapore, Japan, Hong Kong, the Philippines. And the man who had signed the largest of those surrenders spent the next 20 years working for them. Percival became president of the Far East Prisoners of War Federation. He served as colonel of the Cheshire Regiment through the early 1950s. He turned up. He wrote letters to the government. He attended the reunions, year after year, in church halls and hotel function rooms, and stood at the front while men who had been in the camps with him raised money for members who could not work anymore. And he led the fight for compensation. Under the peace treaty signed at San Francisco in 951. Capacity to pay reparations was severely limited, and the mechanism that remained was the seizure and distribution of Japanese assets held abroad. Percival was central to the campaign that pushed the British government to distribute those funds to the former prisoners. In 9,952, the payments came through. They were small, a figure in the region of £76 per man, which was real money to a man who could no longer work a full day, and an insult measured against what had been taken. It was not justice. Nobody involved thought it was justice. But it was obtained, and it was obtained in significant part because a retired lieutenant general with a ruined reputation spent years writing letters and sitting in waiting rooms on behalf of men who could not get anyone to answer them. Consider what that required of him. Every single one of those reunions put him in a room full of men whose captivity began with his signature. Every hand he shook belonged to someone who could reasonably have looked at him and thought, "You did this to me." Some of them did think it, some of them said it, and some said it publicly. And the argument about Percival's competence has never stopped inside the FIPO community or outside it. He kept going anyway, for 20 years. He did not owe them that. He could have taken a quiet directorship in a house in the country and let it all recede. He could have moved to Rhodesia or Kenya the way plenty of men with damaged reputations did in those years. He could have written the angry book, made money from it, and let the historians fight about the aircraft that never came. He went to the church halls instead, and what the men who had actually been inside the camps with him said about him when they were asked was consistently different from what the official histories said. They said he had carried himself the same way in captivity that he had in command. They said he had not asked anyone under him to endure anything he was not enduring in the same hut on the same rations. They said that when the Japanese ordered senior officers to sign undertakings not to escape, he took the position his rank required and took the consequences of it, and that he was slapped and shouted at by teenagers in front of his own subordinates for 3.5 years and never once, in front of anybody, let it show. That is not the testimony of men who thought he was a fool. Arthur Ernest Percival died on the 31st of January, 1966, at the King Edward VII Hospital for Officers in London. He was 78 years old. His obituaries led with Singapore. All of them. And most of them quoted Churchill, because that is what obituaries do. The men from the camps came to the funeral. Now let us finish the accounting, because the other men on that deck have endings too, and put together they say something about the 23 minutes that no single life says on its own. Jonathan Wainwright received the Medal of Honor from President Truman at the White House on the 10th of September, 1945, 8 days after the Missouri. He was promoted to full general. He commanded the 4th Army in Texas and retired in 1947, and he spent his last years being cheered in parades in a country he had spent 3 years believing had written him off. He died on the 2nd of September, 1953. 8 years to the day after the deck of the Missouri, he is buried at Arlington. General Umezu Yoshijiro, the man who signed Standing Up, who would not take the chair, who had argued in front of his emperor for terms that were never going to be granted, was tried at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died of cancer on the 8th of January, 1949. He was 67. Shigemitsu Mamoru, the foreign minister, who climbed that while 300 men watched in silence, was also convicted at Tokyo and sentenced to 7 years. He was paroled in 1950. And then something remarkable happened. He went back into politics. And in 1954, he became foreign minister of Japan again. And in December of 1956, it was Shigemitsu who stood before the General Assembly of the United Nations as Japan was admitted to membership. The same man. 11 years apart. From the deck of the Missouri to the floor of the United Nations, he died the following month in January of 1957. Douglas MacArthur ran the occupation of Japan for 5.5 years, and whatever else is said about him, and a great deal is said about him, the occupation he ran did not produce a stab-in-the-back myth. There was no Japanese equivalent of the Dolchstoß Legende. No serious post-war Japanese movement built itself on the claim that the Imperial Army had been undefeated and betrayed from within. Whether that was because of the ceremony, or the atomic bombs, or the Emperor's broadcast, or the occupation, or all of it together, cannot be cleanly separated out. But the room for the myth was never there, and MacArthur had spent weeks making sure of it. He was relieved of command by President Truman in April of 1951 over Korea, came home to the largest public reception of his life, and died in 1964. Richard Sutherland, who walked those few steps to show a Japanese foreign minister where to put his pen, retired in 1946 and died in 1966, same year as Percival. And the documents themselves. There is a detail about the surrender instrument that almost nobody knows, and that says something about how history actually gets made as opposed to how we imagine it. The Canadian representative on that deck was Colonel Lawrence Moore Cosgrave, a First World War veteran who had lost the sight in one eye at Ypres. When his turn came, he signed the Japanese copy of the instrument, one line too low below the line marked for Canada, and every representative after him, following his lead, signed one line off as well. France on the Netherlands line. The Netherlands on New Zealand. New Zealand at the bottom with no line left. The Japanese delegation noticed and objected. Sutherland took the document, crossed out the printed national designations by hand, and wrote in the correct ones in pen. The Japanese copy of the instrument that ended the Second World War, now held in Tokyo, has handwritten corrections on it. The deck of the Missouri where all of this happened is still there. The ship is moored at Pearl Harbor, a few hundred yards from the sunken hull of the Arizona, so that a visitor can stand between the place the war began for the United States and the place it ended. There is a plaque set into the deck marking the spot where the table stood. The Ford factory at Bukatima, where Percival surrendered in 1942, is still standing too. It is a museum now. There is a room inside it laid out as it was on the 15th of February, 1942, with a long table and chairs, and visitors walk through it every day. 2 rooms, 7,000 miles apart, the same man in both of them. So what do we make of him? Arthur Percival lost the battle. That is not in dispute. It was never in dispute, and he never disputed it. He made decisions in January and February of 1942 that professional soldiers have criticized for 80 years and will criticize for 80 more about the northern airfields, about the defenses on the North Shore, about where to concentrate and when. Some of those criticisms are fair. Some are the product of hindsight applied by people who have never had to decide anything with bad information and a burning city behind them. He was not a great captain. He was a competent, careful staff officer given a command that was strategically indefensible with the resources his own government had allocated to it. And he was defeated by an opponent who was better at the specific thing that mattered most in that campaign, which was speed. And then he was handed something much harder than a battle. He was handed 42 months in the hands of men who understood that the fastest way to destroy an officer is not to hurt him, but to make him small in front of the people who used to salute him. And then he was handed 20 more years as the answer to a trivia question about the worst day in British military history. He carried all of it without ever once trying to hand any of it to somebody else. There were 2 ways for a man to come out of what happened to Arthur Percival. He could spend the rest of his life litigating it, writing, arguing, correcting, explaining to anyone who would sit still that it was not his fault, that the aircraft never came, that the ships were sunk in the first week, that London had made its choices years before he arrived. Or he could go to the church halls. He went to the church halls. And when MacArthur put him on that deck on the 2nd of September, 1945, thin silent, in the front rank, unable to alter one word of the document in front of him, he was not being honored. Let us be clear about that. He was being used. He was a visual argument in another man's ceremony, positioned like a flag or a table because his face was more useful than any sentence anyone could have written. He knew it. He stood there anyway. For 23 minutes, he did the only thing that was ever really being asked of him, on that deck or at Bukatima or in a hut in Manchuria. He stayed where he was put, and he did not look away, and he said nothing. The Japanese officers on that deck refused to bend, and it changed nothing at all. The British officers standing behind them had already broken 3.5 years earlier, in front of the entire world, and had gone on standing anyway. Of the 2, only one of those is difficult.